I'm Evan Smith, the editor of Texas Monthly. Thank God for this week's guest, though he wouldn't dare put it that way. Christopher Hitchens is, as he was described recently in the New York Times, a fervid atheist, and has been since before he even knew to call himself one. And he doesn't mind saying so, loudly. While the topic of one's lack of faith would be, for most writers, too sacred a cow to punch, the famously provocative Hitchens has no problem lacing up his gloves for any reason. And oh boy, has he done so in his new book, the rapidly best-selling God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. As the title suggests, the 58-year-old doesn't hold back in exploring the extent of his contempt for all things spiritual, including religion, organized and otherwise, which he views as a dividing, hectoring, and bullying force. Of course, there are those who read Hitchens' regular columns in Vanity Fair and Slate and see him as a divider, hectorer, and bully himself. And he might not disagree. The native of Portsmouth, England, and graduate of Oxford University has always laid it on the line, damn the consequences, whether the subject is women, whom he has written are not funny, Iraq, he passionately defends the war despite having once been a Marxist, Henry Kissinger, whom he brands a war criminal, or his friend Salman Rushdie, whose death threats by Islamic fundamentalists crystallized for Hitchens the point of view he's now expressing before throngs of fellow non-believers all over the country. But he also has a reputation for being hyper-intellectual, bitingly witty, and extremely charming. And he did not disappoint when he stopped by for a chat in mid-May. A conversation with Christopher Hitchens on this edition of Texas Monthly Talks. Do a version of that. This will be a fun night. Okay. I got the call. On the one. On PBS. Lewis. And then I shot my show to get back to him, but it's okay. Please take your seat. All right, good. Christopher Hitchens, welcome.
Very nice of you to have me.
Happy to have you here in the rodeo buckle of the Bible Belt.
Don't believe in any such thing.
You don't?
No.
So you don't feel outnumbered or outmanned coming to a place like Texas where they say people of faith are in great numbers?
It certainly wouldn't bother me to be the only atheist in the country, but right. I don't believe any of the so-called findings about this.
Why is that?
Well, from experience. I mean, 80% of Americans or so report to the opinion pollsters that they go to church regularly on Sunday. They don't. They lie. I tell you how I know that. Stand in the middle of any town of any size in the country at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. It's not 20% full. Right. There aren't enough churches in any case to take that many Americans. It's easy enough to lie to an opinion pollster about a matter of faith. And people think that's what they ought to be saying. It's one of the ways the religious get things too much their own way.
Is
that everyone's on their side and in their corner. They're not. People like Robertson and Falwell are widely regarded as complete clowns. Someone like Al Sharpton, who I debated in New York, is a charlatan, a mountebank. It's a disgrace. But it does remain the fact that such a man would not get away with this in our culture if he wasn't called reverend. People like this say they demand respect for their faith. Why, they're not getting it from me.
Now, we know that this book is selling. It's going to be number 3, I understand, when it debuts on the New York Times bestseller list next week. Mm-hmm. And it is, as of this morning, number 2 among all sellers on Amazon, behind only the not-yet-released Harry Potter book. So clearly, there are people who are buying this book.
And number 1 in nonfiction, if I may say it myself.
You may say it yourself. But still, this is a book that...
And it's not because of my blue eyes.
Oh.
I know what you were going to say, it's because, in common with some predecessor books by Professor Dawkins, Sam Harris, right. Professor Dennett, it's part of what we were just discussing, a feeling of annoyance at the prevalence of religious bullying and intimidation. Everyone in this studio, including yourself, has been subject to a fatwa, okay, by Mr. Bin Laden and his associates, and we've all been told that he wants us dead. That should be enough to get people alarmed. And that they mean it can't be doubted. You can see how they've managed to reduce the civil society in Iraq, the parties of God, nearly to a state of barbarism now. They say God gave them permission to do it. We say, what an extraordinary thing to be saying, don't we? So how can anyone believe a thing like that? Well, that's my question.
But is that
how can anyone believe that they're doing what God wants them to do?
Is that not the outlier, though, honestly? There are people of faith who do not seek to kill other people or seek to divide their communities or their societies the way that the people you're describing do.
Well, I'm not a person of faith, but I seek to kill the enemies of civilization. And I tell you what, I think it's immoral to tell me to love them.
But
I repeat, it is immoral, as is much of Christian doctrine, to command me to love these people. To the contrary, it should help to organize and discipline and make colder and more rational one's hatred of them and determination to be rid of them.
Well, the ones who wish harm to you, I understand. But if people of faith are of no consequence to you, if they leave you alone, they don't think much about you.
It's the one definition that they can't meet.
Right, which is?
I am a person of faith who will leave you alone. It's not in them. How can it be? They say God cares with whom I have sex, for example. They have to interfere in my life. Some of them say God cares what I eat. They have to interfere in my life. Some say God would mind what books I read. They have to interfere. Others will say it may be more compassionate. Well, they can't watch me go to hell. They have to intervene to stop that, otherwise they wouldn't be my friend. They'll love me to death if they have to.
Right.
The one thing they cannot do is leave me alone. Hence the book. Hence the argument. No, if someone said to me, look, I'll tell you what, Christopher, you and I are not quite the same. I say, well, how is that? So, well, my mother bore me, but didn't have sex with a man before that. I said, I had no idea. I say, well, how fascinating. He said, well, you see, it's like this. Because of that, you have to do what I say. That proves all my opinions are correct. I said, well, hold on. This sounds very weird to me, and actually now rather nasty.
Right.
Well, that's what you're supposed to have to believe.
If it were confined to them and people who believe what they believe, and did not extend over to you. And in fact, there are probably people who would argue that what they believe doesn't necessarily have to extend over to you. Would you be okay with that?
Well, possibly, but I'll tell you what else would happen. They'd start fighting among themselves. It's not they won't leave me alone, they won't leave people of other faiths alone. Most of the murder and torture and killing that goes on in Iraq is of two discrepant kinds of Muslim, slaughtering each other's families. The same is true in India, a Muslim on Hindu. In the Balkans, Catholic versus Orthodox Christians, and then combining to murder the local Muslims. We all get dragged into these terrible wars of faith. No, of course they won't leave us alone. They've gravely retarded civilization for hundreds of years. They're still doing it. There's no possibility of living a life that's untouched by this barbaric belief.
Well, again, let me talk about outliers and non-outliers. Is there a hierarchy in your mind? Certain faiths are more problematic to you in terms of that argument than others?
Well, my daughter goes to a Quaker school, for example, my youngest daughter in Washington. They teach non-resistance to evil, which I regard as an evil doctrine, but I don't regard it as evil as the preaching of evil is, shall we say. So if I'm told, well, do you mean that someone who's a member of the Society of Friends is the same as someone who supports the Ayatollah Khomeini? No, I don't. Of course not. But they all make the same mistake, which is to praise the idea of faith and to elevate it over reason and evidence, and to say, on the most important thing of all, which is why are we here, what are we to do, what is the meaning of our life, on the most important questions, they say that it's very important to decide it without evidence, that you must make an unprovable assertion, and then demand respect for it. Well, I think the sleep of reason brings forth monsters.
Why do you send your daughter to a Quaker school, if I may ask?
Well, I would have sent her to a Hebrew school. My mother was Jewish, and so was her mother. But if the education was as good. The Friends School in Washington is considered a very good school. I would send her to a Catholic school if it had higher standards.
Why not to a public school?
You can't do that in Washington, I'm really sorry to say. I mean, I hate to say it, but I can't use Antonia for a social experiment.
Do you take on the brand of faith that she's being exposed to at that school personally? Do you challenge the people there?
No, I don't have to. No, it's thought. I mean, if they wanted an argument, they could get one, yeah. But I don't want my children to have any knowledge directly of what my opinions are.
Be drawn into this debate.
No, they'll find it out for themselves.
Right. You attended a religious school when you were a child.
Well, you have no choice in my country of birth.
Right.
Religion is compulsory in schools.
Indeed.
I went to a Methodist boarding school, yeah.
Tell the audience and the viewing audience about your first experience with this Mrs. Watts.
Oh, Mrs. Watts. This is when I was even younger at a Church of England boarding school for boys, mainly boys whose parents were in the armed forces, like mine, who were travelling, who were overseas. And we had Mrs. Watts, who was a lovely old lady, a widow, childless widow, fond of children, which I couldn't say for all my teachers. And she took us for nature walks, studying the beautiful part of Devon, southwest England, where I'm from. birds, trees, plants, flowers. And then she instructed us in what was called divinity, the scriptures, which I loved. I used to really like looking up the texts and then working out where the story had come from.